Hi, everyone. Great to be with you this afternoon, just this afternoon. We always start any conversation in terms of what we do about what is the gender pay gap, and thank you for your input in terms of registration. We know many of you are quite experienced or have a high level or reasonable level of confidence in relation to it, but just so that we're all on the same page, the gender pay gap is an international methodology in terms of calculation, and it's the average or median remuneration of men less the average or median remuneration of women over that remuneration for men and expressed as a percentage. I do this because it is really important to be on the same page, and because people often try and conflate the gender pay gap with a calculation of equal pay for equal work, which it clearly is not. And it's really important that it's not. And in fact, in publishing, one of the things we've really been pleased about is what we see as some progression in that debate in relation to that the gender pay gap reflects a combination of pay and composition of a workforce in terms of that percentage that it calculates. The equal pay for equal work might be a subset, and it will be often a subset of that, but the composition and other aspects of pay are important as well. So just to start there, so we're all on the same page. So on the 27th of February, as a result of legislation that was passed last year, we did publish the median gender pay gaps for nearly 5,000 private sector employers, and we also published the gender composition by pay quartile for those same employers. This was, I think, a really important day in our progress towards accelerating change for gender equality. And what you see on the screen there is basically how it's represented on our Data Explorer if you look under the employer tabs. Now, we have published this information by industry. We've published this information on a national level for a number of years, and we had provided this information individually back to employers on a confidential basis. But obviously, this publishing brings a transparency and accountability around gender pay gaps for employers specifically. One of the things, because we know that the gender pay gap is a proxy for gender equality, but no one number obviously represents all aspects of it, is we did create an opportunity for employers to provide an employer statement in relation to their gender pay gaps. And we have got a guide on our website of suggestions about what that employer statement might include. And I encourage you to have a look if you're still thinking about your employer statement. So on the Data Explorer, you can see there was a link for those employers who did provide a statement right next to their gender pay gaps for that to be clicked through to get some context. And we were very pleased that over 1,000 employers provided those statements, which we have published. And it's been really interesting. We've done some analysis on who's provided them, and not, surprisingly, I suppose, is more larger than smaller employers. So, having size and having, maybe an HR team or people to be able to do that work has been a driver of it. Interestingly, that companies with a higher gender pay gap are more likely to have written an employer statement than those with a lower gender pay gap. And from some early analysis of those employer statements, we do see that there's a real, there has been a genuine attempt often to explain what's driving those gender pay gaps, but also explain what the plan is to address them. And that's really the heart and soul of that process to accelerate action, that thinking and that driving of what needs to change as a result of the transparency that comes with publishing gender pay gaps. The last thing I just want to say here is I think it's really important that this has created, and I know we have a lot of HR and D&I professionals on the call today, this process has actually created a new opportunity, if you're not already, to engage with C-suite in relation to these issues. And because the WGEA reports are going to the board, also to engage in the board discussion in relation to gender equality. And we've had a lot of feedback already from a number of HR professionals saying conversations they've been trying to have for an extended period of time, or even decisions in relation to some initiatives and ideas that they've been challenged to get a final decision on, were helped by this focus, were helped by the publishing of the gender pay gaps, in terms of being able to have that time, have that focus, and often get a positive decision in terms of making progress. So I encourage you to use the opportunity of publishing and the ongoing publishing to do that. Finally, employer statements, we are updating them every week. So if you haven't done one yet, but planning on, great, please do it. If things change and you want to update your employer statement, that's fine too. So there's lots of opportunities in terms of it. So what happened? We were really pleased that we really thought there was quite a phenomenal response in terms of the publishing of gender pay gaps. We had a very significant media and public interest. There were thousands and thousands of articles, radio stories, all sorts of media engagement, television news, interviews that happened as a result. To the specifics of the numbers, we did find that CEOs were being asked the question, what's driving it? Why are your numbers so high? Is it the number? And then, partially we got to the composition conversation as well. There was a big focus on some of the female dominant, female industries that are highly feminized, or businesses that are highly feminized, but that sell to women who had high median gender pay gaps. And likewise, industries that had a lot of men, and that common response from CEOs in terms of we just don't have enough women at senior levels. And listed companies obviously had a focus as well. So there was a lot of different areas that the media particularly and individuals focused on, with all sorts of interesting responses. And what we were really pleased about, as I said at the beginning, is that shift in the conversation from, oh, well, I pay people the same if they do the same job, that equal pay for equal work conversation. When that was responded to, I think people were challenged. The CEOs were challenged and saying, well, it's not that. It never was intended to be that. What about what's driving? Why have you got so many men at senior levels? Why are you having trouble, recruiting women? What is driving this gender pay gap difference? And so we were really positive about the shift in that debate. And certainly from our perspective, the focus over the next months as we go to publishing the second round of gender pay gaps is how can we continue that conversation to evolve so that by the time we get to publishing next time, it will be that conversation of, well, last time you had these numbers, this time you've got these numbers. What have you done in the interim? What's driving how are you going to drive change and really keep that momentum going? We also had a phenomenal response in terms of our WGEA resources on the website. Things like our gender pay gap analysis was downloaded many hundreds of times. We had over 200,000 unique users on our website looking at the Data Explorer and getting information, and that has continued. So once again, it's a great resource. Hopefully you've seen it. If not, go to it. In terms of the context and what we expect to see from here, we do draw on the UK experience. And that's because for the last 6 years, the UK has been publishing their gender pay gaps, and a lot of our methodology and experience and defining this process has drawn on their experience. But what they've found is that it really did increase, and it does increase, the understanding of the gender pay gap, their engagement with it. There's been more discussions at executive level, and interestingly, a very significant increase at board level in relation to these discussions around gender equality. And that has been what's driving it, what are the causes, and what are we doing about it? And as a result, practices and policies have been reviewed, refined, changed, improved to help have an impact. And they have seen a reduction in their gender pay gap. It hasn't been massive. This isn't a silver bullet, But the good news is it has been sustained, so that pressure continues. And in fact, they just released their 2024 numbers last week. So it's been interesting to see the media response in relation to that. One last point on, because we observe very closely the research that's coming out of the UK related to publishing gender pay gaps, is that a recent piece of research showed that some employees are actually choosing, when they're deciding about jobs and careers, they're choosing to go with an employer who has a lower gender pay gap, even if the salary is a bit lower than an employer with a higher gender pay gap. Presumably that's based on their view of their experience and what that's going to be like, but also their career prospects and opportunities. So it is having, and it continues to have, a significant impact in terms of a whole range of measures from the UK publishing. The last thing I just want to touch on is where you can find them. And hopefully you've had a look, but if you haven't, our Data Explorer is this incredible resource with a lot of information. And we've actually revised our Data Explorer to really try and help make the information more accessible. So you can find gender pay gaps, but it also is now a much more effective tool for doing comparisons. So you've got an example there. There's your gender pay gaps, but we also things like, well, what's the proportion of women in different roles or different seniority? What about policies in relation to flexible work and parental leave? What about the uptake of parental leave? And so on. So please go to the Data Explorer if you haven't already. You'll see, your numbers for your employer, but you can do some really interesting analysis against your competitors, your peers, your industry, and so on. So I'm going to hand back to Penelope now.
Thank you, Mary. So now we've got a clear view of what gender pay gaps are and why we're publishing them, and the effect we hope to see, and we are seeing in Australia through that process. I'm going to hand now to a colleague, Dr. Camilla Stonia, who's going to share with us what have we learned from the data so far in publishing employer gender pay gaps. Over to you, Camilla.
Thanks, Penelope. All right, so let's jump into the employer gender pay gap snapshot. So this was published alongside, on the 27th of February, alongside when we published all the private sector employers' gender pay gaps. And the purpose of this document was to look at this data across different cross sections. So looking at things like industry, industry type, whether the industry is male or female dominated, for example, the size of an employer, and also the proportion of women in leadership, and how these factors may affect the distribution of employer gender pay gaps and any correlations and interesting insights. So that was the purpose of this document, and I am going to share some of that shortly. But before I do, let's just jump into what the national picture looks like. So WGEA's median total remuneration gender pay gap is 19%. This is calculated from the employer census, the annual employer census, based on the private sector employers. And so it was sitting at 19% last year for total remuneration. You can see that in the table. Base salary was 14.5%, so a little bit lower. So how this is calculated is you take the remuneration data for that's reported to us by employers for just a data set of just under 5 million employees. So it takes all of those employees, lines them up, finds the middle woman and the middle man, compares their salaries, and finds the median gender pay gap of 19%. And that's regardless of what industry or what employer type they're in. It's just looking at that data set at a whole. So that's the median gender pay gap at an employee level. But the purpose of the snapshot document and what I'm about to talk about is looking at employer level gender pay gaps. So let's jump into that. So that's what this distribution on the right-hand side of this slide is showing. It is lining up all of the employer median gender pay gaps, and it's finding the middle value. So the median, the typical employer, what is their gender pay gap? And that's 9.1%, shown highlighted in blue in that bubble there. So that's the number that we are highlighting is a good comparison for employers. 50% of employers are sitting above this 9.1%. So that is an incentive for employers to compare themselves. So we know from the UK that comparing yourselves to your peers drives action. So that's why we're illuminating this number. You can go a step further and look at your industry level employer gender pay gap spread. That's all in the snapshot document. I'm not going to delve into that today, but you can take that level of analysis further. So what is this distribution showing us? Well, first of all, that 30% of employers are sitting in what we call the target range. So a gender pay gap of plus or minus 5%. And that's because it allows for, regular business fluctuations. Getting to that exact 0%, is not easy, but you're still working towards gender equality. But 60% of employers, 62% of employers do have a gender pay gap in favor of men. So the majority do. So that's shown by blue on the right-hand side of this graph, whereas only 8% of employers had a median gender pay gap in favor of women. And that's the yellow left-hand side of the chart there. So that's the overall distribution. But as I said, the purpose of this snapshot was to look at cross sections and see how this distribution may fluctuate, looking at different categories. So the first insight I'd like to share with you is looking at this spread by industry type. So whether employers are in a female-dominated, a mixed gender, or a male-dominated industry, that's what this chart is showing us. The overall insight is that employers in female-dominated industries have smaller gender pay gaps. So your female-dominated industry at the top there, your healthcare, your education fields, 44% of employers sat in that target range shown in orange. Whereas when we look at the male-dominated industries down the bottom, the spread of employer gender pay gaps goes more towards in favor of men, shown in blue. So 76% of employers had a gender pay gap in favor of men. So your construction, your finance fields. So that was the first effect, and it's an expected effect. And that's just because of the high level of male employees in those employees in male-dominated fields. The second insight here is looking at size. So the key insight is that larger employers generally have smaller gender pay gaps. So similar key as before, so in favor of women in yellow, neutral in orange, and in favor of men in blue. But now we're looking at the size of employers on the left-hand side. So WGEA categorizes employers in 5 different size categories, ranging from the smallest being 100 to 250 employees. So 62% of those employers had a gender pay gap in favor of men, whereas in the larger category size of 5,000 employees, you can see more employers had in that gender pay gap in that target range of 40%. So there is a correlation there. So that's looking at size and industry type. But now let's shift over to the proportion of women in leadership and the influence that has. So firstly, we looked at different levels of women in leadership. We'll start by looking at women on boards and the effect that has on an employer's gender pay gap. Key insight was that boosting women on boards could help reduce the gender pay gap. So now we're looking on the left-hand side at the percentage of women on boards in 5 different categories. So a very male-dominated board, 0 to 20%, versus at the bottom there, 81 to 100%. So actually quite a female-dominated board. So we can see, just visually looking at this graph, there's a clear correlation. As we increase the level of women on boards, the amount of employers with a gender pay gap in favor of men is decreasing, and more employers are sitting in that target range in orange. There is a caveat there. We're not promoting 100% of boards to be women, but the important comparison there is in that 40 to 60% range, you can see that more employers are sitting in that target range compared to if you had a male-dominated board, that top category. So there is a clear correlation there, and it's important to note that board members don't go into WGEA's gender pay gap calculations. So this is a cultural, a leadership effect. It's not just the numbers. So that was women on boards. Now moving on to women in management overall. So the key insight is that employers with more women in management had lower gender pay gaps. We looked at this at different levels. I'll get to the CEO in shortly, but if you go into the snapshot document, you can have a look at just women in management overall and women in senior leadership, so key management personnel. They all had very similar effects to the board chart just shown previously. So you can go and have a look at that effect. It's a little bit more expected because those positions and that salary does go into our gender pay gap calculations. So it would be expected those correlations would exist. Increasing more women in senior leadership positions would lower an employer's gender pay gap is a potential driver there. But the women CEO, these are the 2 categories we're looking at, whether an employer does not have a woman CEO versus if they had at least one. And we say at least one, and that's just because of the way employers report to WGEA. They report as a submission group, and therefore they could have subsidiaries with multiple CEOs. So we're just looking at the difference, none versus at least one. And you can see visually that employers with at least one woman CEO had 40% of them sat in that target range, whereas 65% sat in the gender pay gaps in favour of men if they didn't have a woman CEO. So again, that's a cultural effect, because this is based on reporting data where CEO remuneration did not go into our gender pay gap calculations. That is changing, but this is based on data that is just it's more of a cultural leadership effect. So that is a really quick overview of the snapshot document. I would encourage you, it should be in the Q&A function for you to go have a look at the link, download it, look at it in more detail. Definitely the industry level effects is something I would recommend. And if you have further questions, pop them in the Q&A and we can get to them during Q&A time. Otherwise, I will hand back to Penelope. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kimberly. It's great to through the analysis that you and others have done to start to see some of those dynamics that are driving gender equality in workplaces. So those resources that Diana has posted in the chat, that link to the snapshot that Camilla is referring to, are there for you to refer to. And I know that we've shared a lot of information today. It will all be on our website following this session as well. So if you'd like to come back to that detail, it's all there for you. Changing tack slightly, I'd like to take the opportunity to address a couple of common questions that came up both through questions that you'd posed to us in preparation for today and more broadly through our engagement with employers around the publishing of gender pay gaps. So let me talk you through answers to three of the top ones that come our way. First question is, in Australia, as we know, it's illegal to pay men and women different salaries for the same work. So why do we still have, or why do employers still have a gender pay gap? And Mary spoke to this a little as well. It's not legal to pay men and women different salaries for the same work, and that's not the same thing as a gender pay gap. Gender pay gaps are not a direct comparison just of like roles. Instead, what they show is the difference between, as Camilla explained, the average or median pay of women and men across an organisation, across an industry, or across indeed the workforce as a whole. So an organisation's gender pay gap can be driven by some examples of unequal pay, but that's unlikely to account for the whole gender pay gap. Other key drivers of the gender pay gap include things like, and Camilla's kind of highlighted some examples of this, more men in leadership roles, which tend to be higher paid, more women in more junior roles that tend to be lower paid, more men in higher paid jobs or occupations, and women being in lower paid jobs or occupations. There's also often inequality in employee movements, including promotions, for example, and also unequal participation by men and women in part-time work. On the part-time work point, it's important to note that the lowest salary associated with, a reduced salary associated with reduced hours is not actually what's driving the gender pay gap, because in our calculations, we treat part-time salaries as full-time equivalents. So we're sort of always comparing full-time equivalent salaries. So it's not that lowest salary that's driving the gender pay gap associated with part-time work. Where part-time work can still drive the gender pay gap is because part-time and casual roles tend to be less well paid than full-time roles over the course of a year. And also bonus scheme structures tend to favour full-time employees. So you can kind of lose out there through part-time work. And in addition, many senior and higher paid roles are not available as part-time roles. So people, mainly women, who prioritise working part-time may be excluded from those more senior roles that are associated with the higher pay. So that's how part-time work can still play into the gender pay gap. So gender pay gaps are distinct from equal pay for equal work. And there are different things that can sit behind the employer gender pay gap. So we recommend that everyone does the gender pay gap analysis to understand what's driving your gender pay gap in your organisation, so you can take targeted action. And I'll speak more about that in a second. But the second question that we often get asked is, Mary explained carefully what we published this last year, in February this year, and will there be any changes the next time we publish in terms of what we publish? And I saw there was a question on this in the chat too, so let me come directly to that in the way I address this question. There are going to be a couple of changes in what we publish next year. We're going to publish the average base salary and average total remuneration pay gaps alongside the median pay gaps that we published this time around. And the reason we can do that is because in the last reporting period, it was mandatory to include CEO remuneration where it was voluntary previously. And so now we can include CEO remuneration in that calculation. And I'll speak more about that in a second, but I wanted to make that clear as there was a question on that in the Q&A. Importantly too, WGEA will publish the gender pay gaps of any company with 80 or more employees that has its own ABN, including within a corporate group. So if a subsidiary has never reached 100 or more employees, in the past they can opt out of publishing by contacting WGEA using our support at wgea.gov.au contact. So that will be one change. And finally, WGEA will publish the gender pay gaps for all corporate groups, including those that submit their data as part of multiple submission groups. So we will not be publishing by submission groups the gender pay gap unless the submission group itself is a standalone company or a full corporate group. I know some of those details are a bit technical, but there is a fact sheet available on this, and full details are available in our on our website as well. So given these changes in terms of the entities that will publish gender pay gaps for, all employers will receive an executive summary and the industry benchmark report for each ABN that has 80 or more employees and for the corporate group as a whole. So there'll be that clarity of gender pay gap for each of those ABNs. And also as a result, each employer will have the opportunity to provide an employer statement that Mary spoke to earlier, that opportunity to explain both what's behind your gender pay gap and also what you're doing to address it. You can publish one of those for each published subsidiary company that has its own ABN. And as I say, there's a fact sheet that explains all of this in more detail. On a final note around publication, we do often get asked too what the date will be for publication in the next round. And the answer is that hasn't been decided yet, but it is likely to be February next year, similar to the timeline we adopted for this year. So that's the second thing. The third question, and again, this comes to the question that someone posted in the Q&A, is will WGEA include CEO remuneration in gender pay gap calculations next year? And importantly, how do we see that this inclusion might actually affect an employer's gender pay gap? So just to take a back step, until now, employers could voluntarily report their CEO remuneration for heads of business and casual managers as part of their reporting to us. Now with the government reforms, it's actually mandatory to report that information, but given that reform implementation gave employers a year to get ready for that, we haven't included that information in what we published this year. So that's why we've shared just the median and not the average gender pay gaps in what we published this year. But in the second release of gender pay gaps coming up next year, the CEO, head of business and casual manager remuneration data will be included in the data set that you see next year. The importance of that is because with the inclusion of CEO remuneration, it's going to give us a much more accurate representation of the real gender pay gap, because currently nearly 80% of CEOs in Australia are men, so and are more highly paid, increasingly higher paid than their average employees. So it will give us some insight into sort of a more realistic picture of employer gender pay gaps in Australia. So what does that mean? Well, based on the data we have, which has been voluntarily reported to us in the past year, what that means is that when we include CEO remuneration in the calculations, approximately 20% of employers will see their gender pay gap decrease as a result of including that remuneration, and 70% of employers will actually see their gender pay gap increase as a result of including the CEO remuneration for their CEO. So that will be a change that we look forward to with interest in the year ahead. So you've heard a bit about the what and the why of gender pay gap publishing. You've heard a little bit too about what we've learned from the data so far and answered to some common questions that arise in the context of talking about gender pay gap publishing. So where to from here? Importantly, gender pay gap publishing is not meant to be about naming and shaming. It's definitely meant to be a catalyst for action. And Mary showed that example from the UK. That's the intended effect, in fact, is to catalyse action that's sustained in terms of positive change into the future. So now that we've published employer gender pay gaps and employers and employees, in fact, can know them, what can you do about them? So let me talk to you about how to take action on gender pay gaps, as well as share some updates on reporting and also on reporting timelines and compliance. So the first step in taking action on your gender pay gap is to understand it, understand what's causing it in your organisation, in your industry, so that you can really take targeted action to address it. So we always say that doing a gender pay gap analysis is the first critical step that employers can take to understand what's going on in their organisation. And importantly, we've published, and Mary mentioned it's been downloaded multiple times, a gender pay gap analysis guide on our website that takes you through each one of these steps. So it's pretty simple. You just get together you decide your snapshot date, and for those who report to WGEA, you'll probably have that already. It's just a day on which your organisation looks quite typical, a sort of business as usual day in your organisation, mindful of seasonal fluctuations, etc. But once you've set your snapshot date, you get demographic data together, or your employee demographic data together with your payroll data to understand what people are being paid. And again, for those who report to WGEA, it's pretty much the data you report to us, and some also include additional data as well, because it gives them ability to analyse sort of similar job types. And then you do a little bit of data cleaning. It's pretty minimal. It's just, if there's foreign currency, convert it to Australian, etc. So it's pretty minimal getting ready to do the analysis. The meat of it really is about understanding what's driving the gender pay gap by doing a couple of simple analyses that can shed light on to what extent some common causes of the gender pay gap are affecting your organisation, and therefore the extent to which you need to really focus on those areas to take action on it. So those common causes are, there are examples. Most organisations that do this analysis do find examples of men and women being paid differently for equal or comparable work. That is unequal pay. And while it shouldn't be happening, when you do the analysis, people tend to find that there are examples, and of course they address those. As Camilla highlighted, having more men in leadership roles, more women in more junior roles, that drives gender pay gap in many organisations. More men in higher paid jobs, women in lower paid jobs, unequal participation by men and women in part-time work, and inequality in employee movements like promotions. So the guide takes you through the analysis to examine each of those lenses to see to what extent that's happening in your organisation, so you can take targeted action to address them, which is the goal. So in terms of what we're encouraging as next steps for employers, we're publishing gender pay gaps. Obviously do that gender pay gap analysis, use our guide where that's useful. Do develop an action plan, because that's where the change comes from, and there's some guidance from that on that too on our website. And really critically, do share your findings with leadership, and more broadly, you can use our communications 10-point guide, again available from our website, to help you do that. As Mary mentioned, we've been really pleased to see the increased literacy around what are gender pay gaps, what is workplace gender equality, and why and how can we take action on that in our organisation. So leaders are looking for this information from their often HR and DEI teams to educate them on what's going on. So do share your findings of the analysis with your leaders to help improve their literacy and their ability to get behind the action that they need to take. We're also making available through WGEA masterclasses on gender pay gap analysis for those who'd like to go deeper. And again, details on our website of how you can sign up there. So there's a lot of support, a lot of information on our website to help you understand what's going on in your organisation and take action to accelerate change. So I'd like to just take the opportunity, because we always do get questions when we engage with employers about reporting. So let me take the opportunity while we have you today just to share a couple of updates on reporting. And we know reporting's underway as we speak if you're an eligible employer. There have been some small changes to what you report and also to the reporting process that I'll take you through. So in the workplace profile, which is part of your report, some fields are now mandatory from this year, including the employee year of birth, their primary workplace location, so the postcode where they primarily work. And in the workplace profile part of your reports, some fields are now mandatory, including remuneration of CEO, heads of business, and casually employed managers. In the questionnaire part of your report, some fields are also now mandatory, including information about the term limits of your governing body, whether you have targets to address gender equality, whether you have policies and training around sexual harassment on the ground of sex or discrimination, and also employees' access to employer-funded parental leave. Information about paid family and domestic violence leave is voluntary, but there's an opportunity for you to share that as well. So there's some minor changes to the data. There are also some small changes to the reporting process. One is that there was the reporting overview document that you received once you submit your data has now been replaced by the executive summary. And the executive summary you get when you finish reporting, and that will go to your board, as Mary said, along with the benchmark report. Every company that has 80 or more employees can get their own executive summary and benchmark report. And also, as Mary said, we'll have the opportunity to post an employer statement to accompany that when that's published, when the employer gender pay gaps are published on our website. Each company that reports will also confirm their industry, their primary industry, and that's going to be used for the purposes of benchmarking. So the industry that you get allocated to for your benchmark report is one that you nominate as part of the reporting process. You can always keep up to date with any future changes and timelines on our website. And we're also very fortunate to have a key member of our reporting team here on the call with us today who can answer questions that may have arisen for you through this conversation. I'm now going to hand to Mary just to share a bit more on reporting timelines.
Thanks very much, Penelope. And there's a lot of information there for everyone. So as we've said, these slides and this webinar will be available on the website afterwards if people want to reflect on it. And obviously the Q&A and emails to our support line. The last thing I did want to focus on is the timelines for reporting. And I really want to stress how important this is that we will be enforcing these timelines this year. So you must submit your report between 1 April and 31 May or seek an extension prior to 31 May. And that's the requirements of the Act. So that's what's detailed and that's what's required under the Workplace Gender Equality Act. If you do submit an extension, there's an automatic approval for 4 weeks if that's needed, because we understand that sometimes the 2-month period is a bit tight for some people in terms of reporting. You can also request a longer extension if there's extenuating circumstances, and we'll formally assess those requests. There's a process that you can do it either through the reporting portal or just by an email to our support team. But it is important just to stress that the Act specifies April and May for reporting. Seek your extension if you need one before the end of May. We'll be very supportive of that process. But in order to be compliant, and some employers who procure with government over certain thresholds need a compliance certificate, or many want to be compliant with the Act, those deadlines are the ones that are required to be met in order to have that compliance. So great. Back to you, Penelope. I think we're on to the Q&A.
Thanks, Mary. We are. And thanks for those again who've posted their questions. Well, I might just take one quickly because it's nice and simple. But I think there's been a few questions coming in about when are we going to publish gender pay gaps in the next round? And the answer is it hasn't been decided yet, but it's likely to be February next year, in the same way it was late February this year. So stay tuned to our website. We'll update that once the date has been set. One question, I think, for you, Mary, that has come through which is, have any decisions about publishing the gender pay gap for Commonwealth public service employers been made at this stage?
Yeah, and it's a really good question, and it's important because the timeframes of under our Act of the public sector reporting are different to the private sector. So we will be publishing, and we expect it to be early 2025, the first round of federal public sector gender pay gaps based on their 2023 data. Now, they won't be required to submit that data till October and November this year. So later this year for the submission of that data, and then we'll, make sure it's clean, work to get that finished, and be publishing them in early 2025.
Thank you. Arthur, I might send this next question to you because you are an absolute guru of all things reporting. So when we see the total remuneration, the question is that inclusive of variable pay, such as equity plans and long-term incentive plans that are not yet realised?
Ooh, very tricky question. Thank you, Penelope. So in terms of the payment that you're providing for each employee, based on your snapshot date, you're winding back for a 12-month period and you are reporting anything paid to that employee in the 12-month period. So anything that's not yet realized, not yet sort of, it's a potential earning that hasn't actually, been vested or paid to the employee, you should not report it until it is actually paid or vested to the employee. And it works the same way with shares as well. So if an employee is vested with shares, if an employee has access to shares, it is at the point of vestment where you would report the value of those shares as the employee's total remuneration.
Thank you, Arthur. Mary, this might be one for you because it speaks a bit to our sort of future thinking. The question is, will you do further analysis with this data? For example, gender pay gap per state, per industry, etc. I know we already do. We do have industry level analysis. Camilla alluded to the industry snapshots on our website. But what do you see as the opportunity for further analysis, Mary?
I think there's a whole range of analysis that's potential as a result of this. We will certainly be doing some in-house. We will be doing some with our research partner, the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre, and some other research partners that we have and are developing. But the data set is also an open data set, and it will be available on data.gov.au. So it is then available for other researchers or others who wish to delve into the data more so than is provided already on the Data Explorer to do so. So we hope that there'll be lots of really interesting analysis that comes out, and we'll certainly be publishing it as it comes.
There's another question here about Victoria that I might start answering, but it might just to give you the opportunity to comment as well, Mary. The question is that in Victoria, we know that organisations under the Gender Equality Act 2020 have submitted their own reports, similar to the national reporting to WGEA. They submit their reports to the Commission for Gender Equality in the Public Sector. And the question is there any plan to share this information with WGEA? So that's included in future WGEA reporting. So I think I'm speaking to you from Melbourne. So and we do work very closely with the Commission for Gender Equality in the Public Sector and have certainly explored opportunities to bring our work together. The data they collect isn't exactly the same as the data that we collect in the same format. So we still need to collect data from the public sector organisations that we do at the national level. But did you want to comment, Mary, on the plans to bring state public sector into reporting and where that's at?
Absolutely. So in 2021, at the end of the year, there was a national cabinet decision to work towards all the state-based public sectors reporting to WGEA, which we worked very hard on and we're very excited about, because there's about 1.5 million employees who work for state public sectors. Our wonderful federation has proven to have a lot of complexity on what seems like a simple aspiration, and we've been working in detail through a variety of mechanisms to try and progress that decision. It's fair to say Victoria's been fantastic, and we've been engaging with them, as you said, Penelope, to try and work out how that happens. The interesting thing is the data is different that we collect. Some is the same, some is not, and there's a whole range of extra things like policies and practices that we collect that isn't collected by state public sectors. So in Victoria, we're definitely having a crack at how that might look and how that could we could share that data. Because we think the benefits would be fabulous. Not only would you be able to have an insight into the state-based public sectors, do a comparison between states, but also do a comparison between public sector and private sector. So there's a lot of work, but I think it's slow and steady, and we're certainly hoping that we can make progress on that, but it's going to take a bit of time.
Thanks, Mary. And our final unanswered question, I think, Arthur, is one for you. It's a bit of a technical question, but let's make sure we respond, because more than one person might be interested in this. So it's about calculating the annual remuneration of an employee. Maybe they've only worked for 2 months of the snapshot year, and also bonus changes monthly depending on the success of their sales. So is it that we should just replicate the base salary into the total remuneration column for all part-time and partial year workers or not? Does that make sense?
Yes, we always get into the weeds with my questions, but that's okay. It's a good question because it pops up quite frequently from employers. Basically, when you have a part-year employee, how do you essentially provide a full year, full-time earning for that employee? And there's so many different sort of payment types and sort of working patterns, but to zoom it out to sort of the level which I think would help everyone on this call. The employees that you're putting in the profile, you're putting in their base salary and their total remuneration as if they would have worked full year, full time. Now, when we sort of zoom in a little bit into this question, those bonuses based on the success of sales, they're not assured. They're not something that the employee would definitely earn if they worked full year, full time. So, when treating bonuses or other sort of types of payments, which might be conditional, the rule of thumb is essentially, if this employee worked more, is this payment, would they assuredly be paid more of this payment? If the answer to that is yes, you should calculate it. If the answer to that is no, you should treat it as a fixed amount. So if they did earn it, you add it on. And if they didn't, you wouldn't. In terms of your question about how you should be sort of putting payments into each column, based off, speaking about base salary and total remuneration, you're using the unit level profile. Base salary is the ordinary earnings of that employee, so the wages or salary payments, whereas total remuneration is that first figure plus everything else, so including the sort of bonuses and super. What I would direct you to is we do have a reporting guide that has a nice, neat table. It lists all the payments for you and then what column they go into. You can Google WGEA reporting guide, or you can find it from the homepage of our website.
Thank you so much, Arthur. I think we've had one more question come in, which is probably also one for you, Arthur, because it's about reporting dates. So I'll read the question. Mary mentioned that data for the Commonwealth Public Sector gender pay gap reporting will be based on data collected in October and November this year. In 2023 data, the portal reporting was due by October 31. Has the reporting timeframe changed?
So yeah, with the public sector reporting program that we're running this year, it'll be 1st of September to 31st of October. So apologies if we did say November, but yes, 1st of September with a deadline of the 31st of October. Those will be the dates for public sector for this year. And if I could just perhaps tack on an additional question, just because it is something that we're getting quite a lot of cases about. Last year, obviously, when you got your gender pay gaps be released for the first time, we had quite a lot of employers come back to us asking for edits to their submission. I just wanted to just quickly lay out for you how you can edit submissions for this year and the time frame in which you can do it, because it's quite important. So the submission deadline obviously is the 31st of May, or an extended deadline if it is approved by our agency, or if you do request one. When you do finally submit your report for the first time, it enters a 28-day period where you can reopen it and make edits and changes. That period only lasts for 28 days. So it is really imperative that as soon as you submit your report, you've already done your review and approval to submit the report, so that's already been done. But you should probably just do a second look over. This year, we are providing you with the executive summary as soon as you complete your submission. So you will have all of those gender pay gap figures immediately in front of your eyes when you complete the report. We really do recommend you take some time to interrogate your data and ensure that you're reporting accurately. And if you have any questions or issues, please do get in touch. We're really happy to help, but we can't help you reopen a report past that 28-day period because it's officially locked down. So just a quick warning there, you do have edit time, but it is limited.
Thanks, Arthur. I know I said that was the final question, but someone's posted such a good one. I'm going to handle this one as the final question, and then we'll wrap up. Someone's posted this question, which we hear a lot, so I'm glad someone's raised it today. In a male-dominated industry, other than specifically recruiting for women only, can you give any insights into how WGEA expects employers to increase female participation, particularly in those less attractive male-dominated roles? And this is a great question because we know that some organisations kind of get stuck at this point. They say, I feel like I've done what I can within my organisation, but my industry is such that I find it really hard to achieve gender equality. And yet, despite that, others in the same industry probably have made some progress. So what we've seen those who've made some progress do is to do that gender pay gap analysis and understand what is driving their pay gap in their particular case. So say, for example, there's a lack of women in general, a lack of women in leadership. So then the analysis goes to what's going on, why there's so few women in leadership. And people who've, some organisations we've spoken to have done this really well, have been really forensic in understanding their entire employee life cycle. Like, are we not attracting people? Are they not getting through a recruitment? Are they, not being successfully onboarded so they're set up for success into the long term? Are they not being developed and achieving career progression? And are they leaving and dropping out and not making it to leadership positions? And for those who leave, why are they leaving? What was their experience like that we need to take action on so we can keep the women that we do attract? And those who've done that forensic analysis across their employee life cycle, understanding where are some hotspots for them, then they can take some targeted strategies to address that. So one example would be from a tech company we spoke to where they were struggling to get women at all, and certainly women in leadership roles. And they looked at how career progression works in their company. And they thought actually to get to senior levels, you need to have had profit and loss responsibility. You've had to have some overseas experience. Of course, you need a certain suite of technical skills. And they found that women simply weren't getting that portfolio of experiences that equipped them for leadership roles. So they changed that. And they had very intentional pathways for the women that they wanted to keep and accelerate to ensure they did get that portfolio of skills. And then they achieved a sort of gender balance of women in leadership over a period of a number of years. So, and that's a hard industry to recruit women into at all, let alone into leadership roles. So I guess on the final note would say, yes, there are some industry dynamics that are challenging, and also it's possible to take action on those and to do that in concert with others in your industry in many cases as well.